Okay, all right, so we have the meeting recording now. Welcome everyone to our March monthly-ish Project Wild meeting. A reminder, this is an opportunity for us to share things with one another. There's a lot, everybody has a lot going on around the country, and a lot of great ideas that we want to make sure are shared amongst each other and ourselves. On the agenda for today, we're going to have Mark Humpert present about the roadmap to relevancy, or relevancy roadmap. And then also we have some announcements towards the end, and I think we'll have some time for a good discussion as well. So with that, I will try to figure out how to advance the slide. Okay, so I'll introduce Mark Humpert. He's the Director of Conservation Initiatives here at the Association of Fish and Wildlife Agencies. And he works on many different things, including what he's going to present on today. But Mark, I'll let you maybe give a little bit of background about yourself to folks.
Yeah, thanks, Elina, and thank you to all of you for dialing up this afternoon. So yeah, I spent most of my career in Nebraska, working for Nebraska Game and Parks Commission, worked with the Project Wild program. I am certified in Project Wild, although it might be last certification by now. And I've been here at AFWA for about 10 years, and I work with our Conservation Initiatives program, work with our science staff. One of my principal jobs this time of year is working on state and tribal wildlife grants and to ensure strong appropriation. We just had a fly-in that's ending today, where we had folks from all over the country come in and advocate for that program and help members of Congress and the administration understand the importance of that program to states. So yeah, so that's about it. So I wanted to just give you an opportunity to learn firsthand about the Fish and Wildlife Relevancy Roadmap, which is something I've been involved in for the past 6 months or so. And I want to leave plenty of time for questions at the end. So I'm just going to do kind of a brief introduction. So please stop me if something isn't clear, but I'll reserve some time at the end for questions. I think that's something that's, is very apropos to Project Wild coordinators. In fact, I think you're part of the solution to some barriers that we have related to relevancy, and I'll talk a little bit about that. So I'm just going to get right to the first slide. Just you can get the next one, Elina. Just to kind of give a little bit of context, and I know all of you are probably keenly aware that there are some major societal changes that have been in place for a while, but these changes are accelerating and having great bearing on the work that all of you do in the conservation and conservation education world related to education. We're seeing increased diversity across the spectrum. We're going to reach that minority majority AVIX here in the next couple of decades, and that's I think most people would think having a more diversity in our ranks there's lots of benefits to that, but it does create some potential barriers for how we communicate and how we work with folks. We have tended to be as a kind of a system led by older white males, typically the old male, the pale male and stale syndrome, as some people like to call it. But the diversity that changes are creates both opportunity and some constraints too in how we serve public. Next slide, please. We're becoming much more urban. A lot of the work of state fish and wildlife agencies and a lot of the constituents and stakeholders that support state fish and wildlife agencies tend to have more of a rural background. We're becoming much more urban. We certainly see it here in DC as we look out the window, the apartments, buildings that are going up all over the city. There's just a big immigration into city environment, and we know a lot across the country, a lot of the rural communities are losing younger people at a fairly rapid rate. And so those change, you know, I'm not trying to, you know, make any, you know, to take any position whether it's good or bad. It's just a trend that's happening and one that we're recognizing. Next slide. And then, you know, with technological change, one of the things that, one of the trends that, you know, has been apparent for 100 years is the pace of technological adoption has changed. And we know that some of the more modern technologies like tablets and smartphone use, that those become adopted at a very fast rate compared to the past. And I think I've got, I had a different slide. I think I must have sent the wrong PowerPoint. But if you look at this trend of adoption of things like landlines and indoor plumbing and you know, other technologies that were brought into households, you know, it took sometimes, you know, 50 years, maybe even a century for some of these technologies to reach an 80 or 90% adoption rate. And we're seeing now that some of these technologies in less than a decade might reach 50 or 60% adoption. So the pace of technological adoption is another societal change that has an impact on fish and wildlife conservation. And there's go ahead, Elina. And there's lots of other technological or societal changes that are, you know, having some influence on, and will continue to have some influence on how we do fish and wildlife conservation. So to kind of give a little bit of a historical perspective, probably most of you have heard about the Blue Ribbon Panel on Sustaining America's Diverse Fish and Wildlife, a panel that AFWA assembled back in 2015. It was a very diverse panel made up of representatives from business, the oil and gas industry, automotive industry, academics, conservation leaders, and it was chaired by former governor of Wyoming, David Friedenthal, and John Morris, the founder of Bass Pro Shops. And their charge was to look at fish and wildlife conservation, and more specifically, how we fund fish and wildlife conservation at a state level, and make some recommendations, or kind of examine some of the trends that are happening in conservation, and make some recommendations on how we can kind of create a new model for fish and wildlife conservation. And they made two recommendations. The first recommendation, which I hope all of you are familiar with, was a recommendation to invest $1.3 billion annually from oil and gas mineral development on federal lands and waters into fish and wildlife conservation. More specifically, target species that are identified as species of greatest conservation need in state wildlife action plans. So that's the one AFWA has invested lots of resources. We have people here at AFWA working on it daily to try to get legislation passed in Congress that would avail about $1.3 billion of new resources to states to help implement state wildlife action plans. And making good progress. It's been introduced, and it was introduced in the last two Congresses. It's very close to being reintroduced in this Congress, and we continue to build support. And you know, we're kind of pulling all the stops to try to get that passed this Congress and signed by the president, so that kind of an equal amount of funding would be available for the quote-unquote non-game as there currently is for game species. It would really be a game changer and really help us meet the goals of sustaining fish and wildlife resources for future generations. But there was a second recommendation by that panel, and that spoke to the kind of the acknowledging that these societal changes are happening, and it kind of made this recommendation that fish and wildlife agencies need to look at what they need to do in terms of transforming so that broader constituencies can become supporters of state fish and wildlife agencies. There's lots of differences among state fish and wildlife agencies. There's no prototypical one, but in some agencies, fish and wildlife are hunting and fishing and boating and some of those recreational uses tend to be the core constituents of agencies, and there's less attention paid maybe to some of the non-traditional constituencies, or there's not resources to serve them as well. There's other agencies that have more diverse funding sources and can engage more broadly than are very important to hunting and fishing constituents. So this recommendation is really about kind of digging in a little bit and looking at these societal changes and making some recommendations on how we can make state fish and wildlife agencies stronger. And it was Steve Keller, who some of you may know of his writings, who really looked at how people value fish and wildlife, their value orientation, did some seminal work back in the 1970s. Steve was on the Blue Ribbon panel, and he with Steve Williams, who's the former director of Fish and Wildlife Service, former director in Kansas, really championed this. And their argument was, this is kind of two heads of the coin, or there's kind of a chicken and egg thing, that in order to build the support to acquire new funding, especially in the magnitude of $1 billion, we have to find ways to reach broader constituencies. But by the same token, you need more resources and different sources of funding in order to be able to serve those constituencies. So I think it was really smart on the, by this Blue Ribbon panel to recognize that these both are important. And so Steve Keller and Steve Williams started a working group that was pulled from some members of the original Blue Ribbon panel, and started down this path of developing recommendations. And Steve Keller passed away, during this process, unfortunately. And this is something, I'll tell you, this issue was he was so enthusiastic about it, and was working on this, well after he was diagnosed with cancer. And so we lost a little bit of time, lost a little bit of momentum. And so we kind of reconvened last year and pulled together a group of folks that had been working on the Blue Ribbon panel, but some other experts in the field of human dimensions and other folks that have really thought about this relevancy issue, and had a meeting last summer to kind of decide on the direction we want to take to try to implement this recommendation. Next slide. So the association, this group met in Denver. They made a recommendation that what we really needed was a roadmap, that would help states not, be prescriptive in any way, be voluntary for states to use almost like a toolbox in order to become more relevant. So the association passed a resolution at the AFWA annual meeting last year. And that kind of set in motion the organization of a team or multiple teams to start building this roadmap. It's led by Steve Williams, who's now the executive director, president of Wildlife Management Institute, and Tony Wasley, the director of Nevada. And we have a number of directors that are liaisons to each of the regional associations. And then we have a coordinating team that's kind of doing the day-to-day work, coordinating and managing the teams that are developing different aspects of the roadmap. Next slide. And I'll just say we pulled from about 140 individuals we identified that have an interest or specific expertise, and we had to kind of limit it to about 60 folks that are involved in the development of the roadmap at this stage. Next slide. So we developed at the meeting in November, or meeting in December, meeting in Denver last August. We met with some directors and experts and identified barriers, some of the barriers to greater relevancy, barriers to reaching broader constituencies, and put these barriers into 5 buckets, we like to call them, or 5 themes or categories of barriers. And I just included, kind of a few examples of what those are. But, these are somewhat kind of artificial categories, but we needed kind of this context in order to organize our teams, in order to develop strategies. So the strategies were the first step of this was, let's take these barriers that were initially identified at the Denver meeting last summer, and we used 5 strategy teams organized around each of these themes to review the barriers, refine the barriers. In some cases, we added additional barriers, and their charge was to then develop strategies that can help overcome the barriers to becoming more relevant or reaching broader constituencies. Right. So the process that we use, and some of you may be familiar with results chains, but these are basically logic models. We wanted to make sure in our thinking that we were, the strategies that we would recommend and then the associated tactics to those strategies followed a chain of logic that reached an ultimate outcome. So, when we're all said and done, if we had a roadmap that was implemented fully and was embraced by all the states, what we ultimately want to achieve, we don't want to achieve just, hey, we have greater relevance or we are able to reach more constituents. Really, the goal is we want to make conservation better. We want to enhance conservation by broadening the constituencies that are served or engaging with broader constituencies. So the real end result here is we need to have broader constituencies if we want to do better conservation. If we can be more inclusive, engage more individuals, that are outside of maybe some of those sectors like hunting and hunters and anglers, we can do more conservation, we can do better conservation, and we can gain greater support for Fish and Wildlife agencies. So I'm just going to mainly just walk through a couple of result chains so you can get kind of a flavor of what these 5 strategy teams, this is what they spent hours and hours doing, is developing logic chains around strategies. So, one of the barriers that was identified, there's this perception out there that, and there's more than perception, it's reality that, by the broader groups of constituents out there, that Fish and Wildlife agents don't really care about or serve them, that they really serve principally hunters and anglers. This is kind of related to, some big changes we're seeing in value orientations, where folks in the past, we saw a lot more people with traditional value orientations, where they hunt and they fish. Wildlife are used for, scientific endeavors or to eat. To a value orientation now is shifting more towards mutualism, where animals are kind of part of an extended social network, and those changes now are affecting how people feel about, and particularly how they trust state Fish and Wildlife agencies. So that's a barrier out there that we've identified. So what's our strategy to help overcome that barrier? An agency can take steps so that these broader interest groups, broader constituents can feel recognized, represented, valued, and respected. So that's kind of the core. We've got now a strategy that will help overcome a barrier. It's kind of core to what we're trying to accomplish in the roadmap. So in order to do that, again, now we're moving to the right part of this logic chain. We want to get to that long-term outcome, enhance conservation through broader engagement. So what are the steps that will help us get there? So these are intermediate results along this results line. So if we want to, take those steps to engage broader constituents, the agencies themselves have to recognize and define who those broader constituents are. We may not know what groups are even out there and how we categorize them. If we're able to recognize and define those broader constituents, then we need to understand what we are doing now that reinforces their perceptions whether perceptions or reality. What are, you know, and this is really social science work at its core. We have to understand, get a better understanding of the viewpoints of not only hunters and anglers, which we do, you know, in many places a very good job of doing that. We need to find out some of those other groups that aren't engaged, what their perceptions, what they think about, say, Fish and Wildlife Agency. If we have that understanding, then the constituents can become involved in developing a plan, you know, a new path forward. If we get them involved in a plan, then they can help us implement strategies that change how those agencies work and how they, we can change those perceptions, and we can build trusting relationships through increased engagement. If we have that increased trust and engagement, then a broader spectrum of constituents will feel valued. So instead of just hunters and anglers and boaters showing up at those commission meetings, you know, we might have, you know, stakeholders from 20 different groups that have an interest now in the agency and have a desire to, you know, help your commissions or boards better serve them. So that's kind of the, you know, the logic chain. So we've built dozens of these results chains to help define, to help, you know, ensure that the intermediate, that there's logic here for making this strategy something we can implement. So I'll go to the next. I'll go walk through one more results chain real quick. This one, sorry, it's a little bit small to read, but you know, another category of barriers was political and legal constraints. You know, we know that sometimes agency decision-making processes are used and influenced by a limited number of constituents. So there's a lot of folks out there that don't even know that there is a process to influence the decision-making process of your agencies. So the strategy to overcome that barrier is you can modify those decision-making processes at all levels, not just at your commission level, but you know, there's decisions that are made at all levels of State Fish and Wildlife Agency governance. So you can modify those decision-making processes so that they're more inclusive, transparent, and collaborative. So more folks can be aware of the processes, may be invited to the processes to be more collaborative. So in order to accomplish that strategy, we have to kind of look at those current decision-making processes. Where are they? Who's involved in those processes? You have to look at, and so if we accomplish that, the steps within the current decision-making processes that engage stakeholders must be identified. So where in a decision-making process can we bring in stakeholders to help influence and inform the process? If we accomplish that, then we need to understand how and why stakeholders engage with the decision process. And you know, even if folks are aware of the process, they don't engage. They may not engage, and we have to understand why. If we understand why they are not engaging in the decision-making process, then we have to we have to know why the stakeholders do not engage. So that's kind of building off of that, because that's the group that we want to identify so that we can begin developing the strategies to help them engage. So if we understand who the non-engagers are, then we can identify the opportunities to increase their involvement. This might be some type of you know, planning process. If we identify those opportunities, then we can develop a plan to make decision-making processes more inclusive and transparent. If we make the decision-making process more transparent and inclusive, then we'll have broader and more diverse stakeholders engaged, and we'll be more aware of the decision-making process, and this will lead to the decision-making processes themselves will be more inclusive. So the reason we have all these steps is, you know, so right now in this process, we've identified strategies, or we've identified barriers, we've identified strategy, we've identified the results chain. We took this information to the North American Wildlife and Natural Resource Conference. We sent a document with a table of the strategies and barriers and links to the results chains to directors, state Fish and Wildlife Agency directors, and they had a chance to think about it, send in written comments. It was discussed at a directors forum. So we really wanted to kind of test the pulse. Are we getting over our skis a bit, or are we kind of in line of what directors are thinking? And by and large, the directors think we're on the right path. So this is kind of the halfway point in building the roadmap to have strategies and barriers and logic chains. Next slide. So the next part of this is, and we're just starting the next phase. We just finished the review comment period by directors last Friday. The next stage of this is to develop tactics. So we know what those steps in the logic model are, those intermediate results are. At each of those intermediate results, now we want to develop tactics. If you want to reach this intermediate results, what do you need to do? And this is the part that, you know, I know a lot of you are really good at. It's the solutions. But we had to get through the other phase of this first. And it's going to be a really, I think, a fun and intriguing exercise now to develop those tactics. So we're still developing the process. We have the strategy teams that worked on the strategies and barriers. And I think we're going to probably keep a lot of those same folks that were involved in those strategy teams together. We're going to add some new folks. And over the course of the next 3 to 4 months, we're going to build out tactics for all of those intermediate results, the kind of the middle part of those results chains. And that may be one tactic. It may be 5 tactics. Hopefully it won't be 10 tactics for each of those intermediate results on those tactic chains. So the roadmap then, in essence, is a list of barriers, strategies to overcome those barriers, and then tactics to implement those strategies. We haven't really decided on the process yet, but we're working that out, and we've done all of this work thus far in terms of developing strategies via conference calls, weekly conference calls of a couple hours using Zoom. So, you know, it has its benefits because we don't have to get people on airplanes and move them around the country together for a meeting. But, you know, there are limitations too to not having people face to face. I mean, it's interesting. Some of these folks have been on, you know, more than a dozen conference calls, 2-hour conference calls weekly. And, you know, we get it to North America and they hear each other's voices and say, hey, I think I know you. And we want to try to, you know, make this a little more personal, or at least explore options that make it a little more personal. And so we may have an in-person kind of 3 or 4 day workshop to develop the tactics, or we may just use the same approach and do this via conference call. We're really doing this with, you know, really don't have any shoestring budget, you know, not really any resources. So all the folks that have been working on this are contributing their own time, and you know, if we ask them to travel, they'll have to do that on their own. So I just wanted to, you know, kind of where we are on the timeline. We're developing the tactics now. One of the things that we're talking about, our coordinating team is talking about, there's a lot of folks out there, and I think a lot of you on the phone have great ideas that you can contribute. And so we're trying to develop a review process that's as comprehensive as possible, so that, because we know that this group of 60 people, and it'll be expanded a little bit for tactics, they don't have all the answers. So, you know, there potentially will be an opportunity for anybody who has an interest in this to take a look at the draft roadmap this summer and provide comments. Our goal is to present the final roadmap, or it'll still be kind of a working roadmap, but the final first draft of this to directors in September at the AFWA annual meeting in Minneapolis, or in St. Paul, Minnesota. We're going to call this a living document. One of the things we want to do, and this will be, you know, all conditional on State Fish and Wildlife Agency directors giving some endorsement or approval of the roadmap. But if they do approve the roadmap, we're going to launch right into implementation We're trying to secure some resources to begin implementation at the state level. And the way we want to do this is we want to pilot test this in a half a dozen or so states, some that are some that are been doing reaching broader constituencies for many years, and some that this may be brand new. And we want to learn by doing some pilot testing, learn what the barriers are to implementation of the roadmap are. And we'll learn what did we leave out of the roadmap, and then we would incorporate any changes into the next version of the roadmap. We really want this roadmap to be a living document. We're going to use adaptive management to the extent that we can. So that's kind of where we are, and it's I think it's something there's a lot of interest, and this issue of working to broaden the support of more constituents or engaging more constituents is not new. There's been folks at the state level that have been thinking about this, doing workshops, writing papers on this for well over a decade. What this project is doing is just building on that work that's been done, kind of taking it to the next level, and hopefully, providing state agencies with a tool so that we can address societal change by trying to harness try to harness the power of diversity, harness the power of getting more supporters for your Fish and Wildlife Agency involved and understanding of the important role that your agency plays. That's a big part of this. Is there's a lot of folks out there that don't know that the water that they drink is that your agencies are contributing to a lot of their social values, whether they know it or not, whether they hunt or fish or not. You're doing things that add quality of life to them, and we want more people to understand that, but also more people to say, hey, I support my state Fish and Wildlife Agency because of the services that they provide, even if I don't hunt and fish. I think that's all I had, Elina. Oh, I did have one more slide. So we've got a fact sheet out on the AFWA website on this. We're really relying a lot on our directors, those regional liaisons. We're going to the regional association, Fish and Wildlife Agency Association meetings to talk about this, because we're in a continuing input gathering phase where we want all of the smart people around the country that have an interest in this, have something to contribute, want to hear their ideas and concerns, and begin to incorporate that into this roadmap to make it as good as it can be. So we're trying to get the word out, and this is, really appreciate the opportunity today to talk to some of you about this, some Project Wild coordinators about this, because I think it really is something that, this increased relevancy, in states that have, had some success in that, the educational outreach that agencies do. Project Wild is unique in that it goes the entire spectrum of users out there, whether you hunt and fish or bird watch or just our general nature enthusiasts. Project Wild works for you and is for you. So I think Project Wild does help tap into some of those constituency groups that some state agencies may not be able to in any other way. So I think you're going to be a big part of continuing to be kind of the implementation arm of the roadmap going forward.
Okay. All right. Thanks, Mark. If you have a question for Mark, just let me know in the chat box, and you can unmute yourself as well. But Mark, I do have a question for you to get the ball rolling. The strategy that you had seemed very broad and general. Is that so states can implement them or develop, and the tactics that you're developing, are they going to be specific to each state, or are they more broad and more general? Yeah. And how do states adapt those? Yeah,
and that's a great question. And where's the sweet spot between being too specific and too general was something we spent a lot of time thinking about. We did kind of go more on the general side of the equation, and I think the tactics will try to stay a little more general. The roadmap is designed, well, there's a couple of things. It's called a roadmap because there's no single path to engaging greater constituencies. All this is intended to do is really start the conversation in your agency, provide some resources and tools, maybe a little bit of direction. But we fully expect that if a state agency makes that decision, we want to, in a larger way than we are now, address this issue of relevancy, that you're going to take this roadmap and make it much more specific to your agency. And you know, there's some barriers that may not apply at all to some agencies. There may be some barriers that are just too steep to try to overcome right now. So, you know, the non-prescriptive nature of this is really important. It's a tool, it's a resource to use. There's no pressure on any state to use this. But the specificity issue is going to happen more, you know, we envision that if a state wants to take this on, that they would form a steering committee. We're hopeful that if we can get some grant funding, we're going to be able to provide some resources to bring in consultants that can help guide a process, and that then this roadmap would then be a resource or a tool that any state agency could use to begin addressing the barriers. There might be new barriers that the state decides are important, and you know, you might want to use a similar process to develop the tactics for a new barrier, and then, you know, we would want to incorporate that into the next version of the roadmap so that all states could benefit from that.
Mm-hmm. All right, thanks. Kelly Reynolds has a question. Kelly, you want to unmute yourself?
Yes. Thank you. Thank you, Mark, for sharing this with all of us. And thank you, Elena, for inviting Mark to share. I think it's really exciting to learn more about this project. And my question is, has there been any discussion amongst the groups of kind of like reflection or evaluation at some point down the road? You know, I don't even know if that would be after a year or a few years of kind of evaluating those tactics and what has worked well or not as well?
Yeah, so that, and I didn't really talk about this because it's something that's really in the early stages of development, is a kind of a performance measurement framework is something that we just started working on. That would be part of this. So how do you measure change? How do you measure implementation? So we've got some, and I didn't mention who's really been part of this. The Wildlife Management Institute, in addition to Steve Williams, have kind of loaned us Chris Smith and Matt Dumpy. Chris has spent a lot of time thinking about relevancy, and Matt Dumpy is kind of an expert in development of logic models, along with Ann Borshen, who's a social scientist in Florida, who's been working on this for well over a decade, and Jen Newmark from Nevada, and Jason Sumners from Missouri. Those are all folks that are part of this coordinating team. And this issue of how we measure our progress is a really important one, and we're going to look to some outside resources to help us develop that. But that's in the timeline of being developed prior to us finishing the roadmap, so it can be incorporated into the roadmap.
Gotcha.
But
thanks.
I can't tell you a lot of details of what it's going to look like at this point, but it's something we're working on.
Yeah, thanks.
Okay. Well, Mark, I want to thank you for your time. I know you're super busy, lots going on these days, so appreciate this update. And for all the folks that are on the phone, I'll be sure to keep you updated as to what's going on with this process here, because I think it'll be of great interest to the work that we do. So
great.
All right. Thank you, Mark.
Elena.
Okay. So next we have some updates, and okay. All right, Kelly, I'm going to throw it over to you. You're muted, Kelly.
Oh, thanks. I can't see your screen just yet.
Sorry about that. Hold on. Let me figure out how to share it then.
No problem.
So how about while I figure that out, it's about the conference.
Yes, okay. All right, I will just jump in and let you guys know that May 1st is the deadline for registering. It's the deadline for submitting your Facilitator of the Year submissions. And it's the deadline for outstanding coordinator nominations. So I know some of you know the drill and some of you might be doing this for the first time. For Facilitator of the Year, you just tell us who your Facilitator of the Year is and we make a nice certificate that you can present to him or her to acknowledge their work. And different coordinators do that different ways. So you might have a process of folks nominating facilitators within your state, or you might just kind of select somebody that you know has done noteworthy work in the past year since last conference. So get those in. There's a Google form. The link is on the conference website by May 1st, so we can get those together. The outstanding coordinator nominations, we did keep the nominations from last year, aside from, Mary was our outstanding coordinator last year, but it does take some time to pull all that information together, so we thought we would, keep nominations for at least another year. And you can also do a self-nomination too. Don't feel like you have to sit around hoping that somebody submits a nomination. Those self-nominations are welcome. On the conference website, I have updated the preliminary schedule. We had a lot of folks submit session proposals, so we're really looking forward to seeing those this year. There's a lot of good stuff in there. So you can check out the conference schedule on our website to see what has been added. What else? Conference book. Oh yeah, so we have a book club. We have a book that we encourage anybody to read who wants to join in on a discussion. It's called Wolf Wars by Hank Fisher. You can find that information on the conference webpage. And we also put a few different articles from Montana Outdoors, which is the publication of Montana Fish, Wildlife, and Parks. Just in case reading a book is a little overwhelming ahead of the conference, you can just read one of those articles. And then at lunch, I believe it's on Wednesday, we're going to divide into tables, and some of our conference planning team leads are going to facilitate just kind of a informal book club discussion about those readings. Make travel arrangements if you're planning on attending. Reserve your car, book your flight, go ahead and get that stuff taken care of if you haven't already. And we do have a Google Sheet where we are encouraging folks to put their flight time and their rental car information to help connect people who can carpool from the airport to Chico Hot Springs. So that link is also available on the conference website. And if you have any questions, just give me a call or email me.
All right, thanks, Kelly. And I have to say I'm on chapter 4 of the book, and it's pretty good so far. Very interesting. Okay, Mark Lefebvre.
Hello. So I wanted to just acknowledge who's signed up for committees. We made a call recently for folks to help out with 3 different Project Wild coordinator committees, and we have on the Oh Dear committee, the folks that will be helping with the next update of that activity: Lori Adams, Natalie, Anita, Susie, and Doyle. And for the Flying Wild committee to help with, as we plan for updates to Flying Wild, we have Susie and Carrie. If you think you joined a committee and didn't hear your name or wanted to get on one, just let us know. And Kelly, I'll let you let us know who signed up for the Coordinator Handbook Committee.
Yes, we have on our committee Susie in Virginia, Kim in Georgia, Heather in Colorado, Kiki in Texas, Kimberly in Rhode Island, Denise in Washington, and Jerry, who works with the Salvation Army. So thank you all. I'll be sending you chunks sometime in April for you to read through and let us know what you think.
Wow, thank you everyone for signing up for that committee. I thought that would be the hard one to recruit people, but apparently folks think it's an important thing to do. So thank you all so much. We appreciate that. And then we do want to let you know that Jen Welsh is going to be retiring after 26 years as our Minnesota Project Wild State Coordinator. We have sent her a gift, and we certainly do wish her a happy retirement. I don't know, Kelly, I don't know if there's such a thing as like a online card we could send her where people could sign. I don't know if there's such a thing. Does if anyone knows of anything like that, let me know. Okay. Kelly, did you want to update folks about the North American meeting?
Yeah, so we attended, Elena and I attended, well, and most of the AFWA staff. Mark was at a different conference representing for Project Wild. Elena and I were at the North American Conference. It was in Denver this year, March 4th through 8th. That is when the Project Wild subcommittee meets, and every AFWA operates through committees. So our subcommittee is underneath the Education Outreach and Diversity Committee. And we had a good meeting. Heather was able to present and share a little bit of information about Project Wild offerings in Colorado and some of the work that their regional education coordinators do. And Rusty was there, he's the chair of the committee, and Tabby Kenyon, former Colorado coordinator who now works at Arkansas Fish and Game, was there. So we had some good wild representation and a lot of other folks. And the minutes will be posted online, so you can check there if you're curious, or if you just want to contribute to that conversation. And then we also had a Project Wild report to the directors at the business meeting, and Rusty gave that report, and it was kind of just a check-in because the directors approved to bring Project Wild on board as part of AFWA, so Rusty took some time to let them know how it's been going over the past couple of years. And Elena had put some slides together that Mark and I helped, and then we sent those to Rusty, and he gave a great presentation, and we just want to let you guys know that it was a nice time to highlight the work of Project Wild that you guys are doing all across the country, supported by us at the national level. And so not all of the directors are in the room, but a lot of directors were there. So it was a little time to say, yay, good work, and to celebrate all that's happened with Project Wild being part of AFWA.
Okay, before we get off the phone, I'm wondering if anyone has any announcements or things that are coming up, exciting things that they want to share with anyone, with us, with the group. I know you all have a lot going on, especially this time of the year. Our next monthly-ish webinar will be April 25th at 3 p.m., slightly different time because that's Kelly's birthday. So we're going to give her a little bit of extra cupcake time over lunch in Texas. So, all right. If nothing else, then we'll go ahead and end the meeting for today. And thank you all for your time. Appreciate it. Bye, everyone.